I remember that day in great detail. October 31st. The fall wind blew yellowed leaves across the Omaha airport runway, and I stood with a small military bag at the arrivals terminal, breathing the air of my native Nebraska, so unfamiliar after the dust of Afghanistan. 12 months of service were behind me, and now home was waiting for me. I'd seen Audrey from a distance. Her red hair, gathered in a high ponytail, blazed in the October sunlight. She was running toward me across the parking lot, maneuvering between cars like the day we'd first met on campus. She was wearing the same dark blue coat I'd given her before I left. I smiled as I noticed she still held its hem with her hands as she ran, a habit I remembered from all those months away from home. "Garrett, oh my God, finally." Her voice shook as she threw herself around my neck. She smelled like homemade baked goods and some new perfume, not the same perfume as before. I hugged her tightly, burying my face in her red strands, and for a moment the world around me ceased to exist. Everything I'd dreamed of during those long months in the hot desert was finally coming true. Audrey was here, in my arms, alive and real. "You've lost weight." She pulled away, scrutinizing my face. "And tanned. And those wrinkles near your eyes. They're new. And you're still as beautiful as ever." I couldn't stop smiling as I looked at her face, so familiar and yet slightly changed at the same time. Or maybe it just seemed that way to me after a long time apart. The drive from Omaha to Norfolk took about 2 hours. Audrey drove the car, a used gray Ford Focus she bought 6 months ago. She had told me about it in one of her emails, but seeing it in person was strange. Like so many things, this car came into her life without me. "You know, I purposely took tomorrow off." She threw me a quick glance. "I'm going to make your favorite apple pie. Remember when I taught you how to make it?" "I remember. I almost burned down the kitchen then." I laughed, remembering that night 5 years ago. The radio was quietly playing some song I didn't recognize. Outside the window were endless cornfields, already harvested for winter. The sky was amazingly blue, without a single cloud, a sky I had not seen in all those months in Afghanistan. Our house greeted me with silence and coolness. I paused on the threshold, breathing in the familiar smell, a mixture of wood, old books, and that special aroma that only comes from one's own home. I'd bought the small 2-story cottage on Madison Street before I'd married, using up all my savings and taking out a loan. It had 3 bedrooms, a spacious living room, and a cozy kitchen overlooking the backyard, a place where I dreamed of growing old. "I've kept the place tidy." Audrey ran her hand along the wooden railing of the stairs. "Really had to replace the water heater in August. And then there's that creak on the 2nd floor." I climbed the familiar steps, each one holding a different story. Here, on the 4th from the bottom, I'd proposed to Audrey. And on this one we sat the evening after the wedding, tired and happy. Our bedroom hadn't changed much. Same beige curtains, same old mahogany dresser I got from my grandmother. On the bedside table was our wedding photo, me in my dress uniform, Audrey in her snow-white dress. "I used to look at that photo every night," she said quietly, hugging me from behind. "Especially when I haven't heard from you in a long time." I turned to her and she reached up for a kiss. Her lips were soft and slightly salty. She'd been crying, though she tried to hide it. We spent the evening in the kitchen. Audrey had actually baked an apple pie, and its aroma filled the whole house. We sat at the old oak table, drank tea from our favorite ceramic mugs, and I talked about the service. Only the good stuff, of course. About setting up a military camp, about teaching the local kids how to play baseball, about celebrating Christmas in the middle of the desert. I didn't talk about the endless patrols in the blazing sun, the whistle of bullets and the rumble of explosions, the dead comrades. All that was left out there, thousands of miles away. Here there was only our cozy home, the smell of apple pie, and the beloved woman across the hall. "What about you?" I asked when the stories were over. "How's work at the paper?" "Oh, we have so much going on." Audrey perked up. "You know, I've been entrusted to run my own column. Now I'm writing about city events, interviewing important people. Last week I chatted with the mayor about the new downtown redevelopment project." There was a new note in her voice, a confidence, even a kind of authority. She'd changed over the year, become more independent. I suddenly caught myself thinking that I didn't know whether to be happy or not. At night, I couldn't sleep for a long time, listening to Audrey's quiet breathing and the unfamiliar sounds of the house. The floorboards creaking somewhere, the old clock ticking in the living room, the leaves rustling outside the window. Everything was so familiar and yet so unfamiliar, like I was back in a place I remembered, but it had changed in my absence. I stared up at the ceiling, where the moonlight drew bizarre shadows, and thought about how strange it was to come home. Everything seemed to be the same walls, the same furniture, the same pictures on the walls, but something was subtly different. Maybe it was Audrey's new perfume, or that unfamiliar creak on the second floor. Or maybe it was me. I'd changed over the year too. Audrey turned in her sleep, snuggling against my warm side. I cuddled her gently, breathing in the scent of her hair, and thought that things would get better. It has to get better. We just have to get used to each other again, to rebuild what was broken by the long separation. The last thing I saw before I fell asleep was our wedding picture on the nightstand. It seemed almost black and white in the moonlight, like a snapshot from the distant past. On the third day after my return, I realized I was suffocating within the four walls. Audrey was at work. She'd been promoted to senior editor of the city newsroom, and now she often stayed late. I wandered around the empty house, going through old things and trying to get used to the peacefulness of life. After the constant tension and adrenaline, the silence seemed unnatural, almost ominous. Dex's call came at just the right time. His gruff voice in the receiver sounded just like it did during our nightly desert patrols. "Thornton, get your ass up. We're at Old Johnny's tonight at 7. Everybody will be there." Old Johnny's hadn't changed in a year, the same worn sign, the same wooden tables scratched with customers' initials, the same smell of beer and roasted peanuts. I was the first to arrive and sat at our usual corner table, from where I could see the whole room. The military habit of always keeping an eye on all the entrances and exits hadn't gone away. Dexter showed up at 7 sharp, still as taut and silent as ever. The only thing that distinguished him as a former sniper was the special scrutiny he gave the room before he sat down. "How's the citizen?" he asked, ordering a beer. "Not used to it, too quiet." He nodded understandingly. Dex worked as a night security guard at the mall, the perfect job for someone who'd gotten used to sleeping at night. Wesley rolled into the bar like a small hurricane. His red hair was disheveled and his hands had traces of machine oil on them. "Sarge!" he yelled across the bar, raking me into a bear hug. "Damn good to see you!" He smelled like gasoline and metal. He'd opened his own machine shop right after he'd returned from his last tour of duty. "Better to fix cars than blow them up," he said with his trademark smirk. Lance was the last to arrive, in his medical uniform, tired after a 24-hour tour of duty. He shook my hand silently, and there was more understanding in that handshake than in the long conversation. Lance had always been like that, a little wordy but dependable as a rock. "Here's to coming back." Wesley lifted the mug. We clinked glasses. The beer was cold and unaccustomedly bitter after the long break. There was some country song playing at the bar, laughter and scraps of conversation coming from the neighboring tables, an ordinary evening in small-town Nebraska. "How's Audrey?" Lance asked, looking at me carefully over his mug. "She's okay, working hard, promotions and stuff." "You know," Dex set the beer aside, "we've seen her around town sometimes, with some guy in an expensive suit, sort of on business. She interviews all sorts of people, part of the job." Wesley hummed but remained silent, which wasn't like him. "Tell me more about how ours did in the last operation." Lance changed the subject, and we started talking about things that only the four of us understood, about night raids, about sandstorms, about celebrating Red's birthday under fire, the ones who didn't come back, Mikey Perkins who got hit by a landmine. Joe Ramirez caught a sniper's bullet. Every sip of beer made me feel better. You didn't have to pretend everything was okay here. You didn't have to watch your words for fear of scaring your loved ones with war stories. These men knew everything I knew, saw everything I saw. Remember that day in Kandahar? Wesley twirled the empty mug in his hands. When we got stuck in that village? And how to forget it? Dex grinned grimly. 48 hours in an old house, no communications with 2 wounded. If it hadn't been for you, Garrett, Lance put a hand on my shoulder, we would have stayed there. I remembered that day in great detail. I remembered making the decision to go for help, crawling up the rocky slope, praying to all the gods I knew that I'd make it back in time to get reinforcements. He did. Everyone was pulled out. To the commander. Wesley raised a new mug. To the commander, the others echoed. I looked at their faces, lit by the dim light of the bar lamp, and thought about how strange life was. These people weren't my kin, but I trusted them more than I trusted anyone. We'd shared the last of the water in the desert, had each other's backs, pulled each other out from under fire. That's the kind of thing you don't forget. I got home around midnight. Audrey wasn't there yet. She was late at work again. There was a plate of dinner on the kitchen table, cold and carefully covered with a towel. I didn't eat, just sat in the dark, staring out the window at the empty street. Something had changed. I couldn't say exactly what it was, but I could feel it in my gut. Maybe it was Audrey's new perfume, which I didn't recognize, or the way she avoided looking me in the eye when talking about work, or in these delays of hers that were happening more and more often. The front door creaked quietly around 1 o'clock in the morning. I heard Audrey carefully undress in the hallway as she walked up the stairs, skipping over the creaking steps. Sorry, love. She peered into the kitchen. Important article. Had to finish it for this morning's edition. It's okay, I replied, continuing to stare out the window. Work is work. She stood in the doorway for a moment longer as if she wanted to say something, but then she just went upstairs. I stayed sitting in the kitchen, listening to the night sounds of the house and trying to figure out exactly when things started to go wrong. Dex's words about the man in the expensive suit rattled around in my head. Other thoughts, too, about how Audrey had changed over the year, how there were these new notes in her voice, this strange detachment in her gaze. I chased those thoughts away, but they came back like pesky flies. My phone vibrated on the table, a message from Dex. If you need us, we're here for you, I smiled. This was it, the one thing that remained unchanged. A brotherhood cemented by the blood and sand of the Afghan deserts. No matter what happened, these men would be there for me, as they were in Kandahar, as they will always be. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Audrey paced the bedroom, preparing for sleep, so familiar and so foreign at the same time. I finished my coffee and got up. It was time to pretend everything was all right. I'd learned to do that in the war, to pretend that everything was okay, even when everything inside was clenching with a premonition of trouble. But the war had also taught me to trust my instincts, and they were screaming that something was wrong. A week passed. Audrey stayed late at work more and more often, and when she returned, she smelled of the same unfamiliar perfume and strange cologne. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know the answer. Or maybe I was afraid to hear it. That morning, she came down to breakfast looking particularly enthusiastic. She was wearing a new business suit, dark blue, with a tight skirt and white blouse. I didn't remember seeing it before. Honey, she placed a cup of coffee in front of me. There's something we need to talk about. Something in her voice made me wary. In 15 years of military service, I'd learned to sense danger, and now every instinct screamed threat. I've been thinking about our future. She sat down across from me, carefully spreading the napkin on her lap. You know how unstable things are right now? Prices are going up, taxes are going up. I drank my coffee in silence, watching her over my cup. She was nervous. The small details gave away. The slightly trembling fingers with which she was rubbing her napkin, the slight blush on her cheeks, the avoidant look in her eyes. Anyway, I consulted with a financial expert. She pulled a file folder from her new leather bag. He advised us to restructure our assets. It will save on taxes and secure our assets. Restructure? I set the cup aside. My throat was suddenly dry. Yes, it's a simple formality. She slid the papers toward me. We just need to update some of the paperwork. You know how worried I am about our future. I took the first sheet. The text blurred before my eyes. Fine legal print full of obscure terms. Somewhere in the back of my mind, an alarm bell was ringing. Maybe we should show these documents to a lawyer? I tried to buy time. Honey, she covered my hand with hers. It's just a routine procedure. Besides, they've already been reviewed by a very good professional. You trust me, don't you? Do I? Until a week ago, I wouldn't have hesitated to say yes. But now, of course, I lied, feeling everything inside clench. Then sign here, here, and here. She handed me a pen, an expensive one, with a gold nib knot the ballpoint she usually used. I mechanically signed where she indicated. Each stroke of the pen on the paper felt like a deep ache inside. Something was wrong. Very wrong. That's it, she gleamed, gathering up the paperwork. Now we have nothing to worry about. She kissed my cheek and hurried off to work, leaving me alone in the kitchen with unfinished coffee and a heavy feeling of foreboding in my chest. All day long, I couldn't find a place to be. I replayed the morning conversation in my mind, trying to figure out what was bothering me so much. The military intuition that had saved my life so many times was now screaming danger. I called Dex. Hey, buddy. His voice sounded sleepy. He'd just gotten back from the night shift. What's up? I don't know, I answered honestly. I feel something wrong. He was quiet for a few seconds. You know, there's something I've wanted to tell you for a long time. About your wife. Don't, I cut him off. Just stay in touch, okay? Always, Sarge, always. I wandered around the house, looking at the pictures on the walls. Here's Audrey and I on the day we met. She in a summer dress, me in my cadet uniform. Here's our wedding. She's beaming with happiness, clutching a bouquet of white roses. Here's the last photo before I left for Afghanistan. She's crying, trying to smile. When did things change? On the living room table was her day planner. Leather, gold embossed. I'd never read her notes, I trusted her. But now my hand reached for it. Inside were the neat lines of her handwriting. Meetings, interviews, business lunches, lots of meetings with some KH almost every week, and a phone number circled with a heart in the margin. I slammed the diary shut, feeling like a traitor. But a traitor? Audrey came home late that evening as usual. She smelled of wine and that stranger's cologne. Sorry, honey, she pecked my cheek. Important meeting with a source. You understand? Work. I understood. I understood too well. Those documents? I began. Don't worry about that. She waved her hand. I already gave them to the lawyer. It's okay. Lawyer. I wonder if it was the same CH with the heart in the margin. At night, I couldn't sleep again. I lay staring at the ceiling and listening to the breathing of the woman sleeping next to me. So familiar and so alien at the same time. The leaves rustled outside the window. The clock in the living room ticked. A car drove by somewhere in the distance. The usual sounds of peaceful life. But inside, I was growing anxious. The same kind of anxiety that comes before a battle, when you know that something terrible is about to happen, but you can't change anything. I pulled out my phone, opened the messages from Dex. We're here for you if you need us. Yeah, they are. My brothers in arms. The only ones I could trust unconditionally. In the morning, I woke up to the sound of the front door slamming shut. Audrey had left early, urgent editorial meeting, the note on the kitchen table. For some reason, I remembered her saying, now we have nothing to worry about. Why couldn't I shake the feeling that I'd signed my own death warrant? I made coffee and sat by the window. There were people walking down the street, people going to work on errands, just out for a walk. Just an ordinary morning in a small Nebraska town. But inside, everything was clenched with a premonition of trouble. My phone vibrated a message from Lance. How are you, friend? I didn't answer. What could I say? That my wife smelled like someone else's cologne? That I signed some documents without even reading them? That I no longer recognized the woman I'd lived with for 5 years? The doorbell rang. The mailman brought a letter. A utility bill. Such a simple, ordinary thing. But the name on the envelope is just hers, not ours. When did that change? I pulled out my phone, found Dex's number. My finger hovered over the call button. No, not yet. I need to figure this out for myself first. Figure out what's going on. Even though my inner voice was already screaming that I knew. I know, but I'm afraid to admit it. On the desk was her day planner, CH and a heart in the margin, hastily signed documents, someone else's cologne, new perfume, late returns. It all added up to a picture I refused to see. My parents lived in a suburb of Omaha, in the same house where I spent my childhood. I decided to visit them over the weekend. I needed to clear my head, get my mind off the heavy thoughts. Audrey said she couldn't go. Urgent material for the Sunday edition. Say hi to your mom. She kissed me goodbye, and I caught that unfamiliar scent of perfume again. The drive to Omaha took almost 2 hours. I drove down the empty highway, listening to old country songs on the radio and trying not to think about the papers I'd signed 3 days ago, about how Audrey had hastily put them away in her bag, about how she'd avoided my gaze. My parents' house greeted me with the smell of my mom's baked goods and the familiar creak of the wooden porch. Nothing had changed here. The same lace curtains on the windows, the same old swing in the garden, the same worn rug at the entrance. Son! Mom ran out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Why alone? Where's Audrey? Work, I answered briefly, hugging her. Dad was in the garage tinkering with his old Chevy, a perpetual project of his retirement years. When he saw me, he silently wiped his hands with a rag and hugged me tightly. He smelled of engine oil and tobacco, the odors of my childhood. How was the service? He asked later, as we sat on the back porch with bottles of beer. Finished, I took a sip. Now here we are, trying to get used to it. He nodded understandingly. Having been through Vietnam himself, he knew what it was like to come back. And how? He hesitated. Like home? I looked at him. There was understanding in his eyes, the kind of understanding that only happens between a father and son. I don't know, Dad, I answered honestly. Something's wrong, but I can't figure out what it is. He was silent for a long time, looking at the setting sun. You know, son, when I came back from Vietnam, your mom was waiting for me. Wrote letters every day, even though I couldn't always answer. And when I came back, she greeted me with the same twinkle in her eyes she saw me off with. I understood what he meant. Audrey no longer had that twinkle in her eye. All evening, my mother fussed over me, cooking my favorite foods, asking me about life. I answered briefly, trying not to go into details. I didn't want to alarm them with my suspicions. At night, I lay in my old room, looking at the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. I had glued them on as a child, dreaming of becoming an astronaut. The phone was silent. Audrey hadn't called to say goodnight. When I left in the morning, I hugged my parents tighter than usual. Something told me I would need their support soon. The first call came when I was halfway home. Mrs. Parker, our neighbor, who always kept an eye on everything that was going on outside. Garrett, dear, I don't want to alarm you, but... Her voice trembled. There are some people walking around your house, with a camera, and they've put up a sign. What sign, Mrs. Parker? For sale, she exhaled. The big one on the lawn. I almost drove into a ditch. When I pulled myself together, I asked, What about Audrey? Is her car at home? No, honey. She left early this morning with some man in an expensive car. Took a lot of stuff away. I remember the rest of the drive vaguely. I only remember gripping the steering wheel to the point of pain, the speed meter going over 100 miles an hour, the other drivers honking indignantly as I overtook them on the side of the road. The sign was indeed on our lawn, a big white one with the red letters for sale and the phone number of some real estate agency. I yanked it out with one tug and tossed it into the trunk. The house greeted me with silence, the eerie, unnatural silence of an empty house. Her things were gone, no clothes in the closet, no makeup in the bathroom, no favorite collection of books on the shelves. Even the photographs had disappeared from the walls, leaving light rectangles on the faded wallpaper. On the kitchen table lay an envelope. Inside were copies of the very documents I'd signed, the deed transferring ownership of the house, my signature on every page, and a short note. I'm sorry. It's best for everyone. I sat up straight on the floor, leaning my back against the wall. My head was buzzing, and my eyes were swimming in circles. How could I have been so blind, so gullible? The phone was ringing off the Hookdeck's Wesley Lance. Apparently, Mrs. Parker had called everyone, but I couldn't bring myself to answer it. I couldn't say out loud what had happened. The doorbell rang. Then there was a knock. Then I heard Dex's familiar voice. "Garrett, open up, brother. We know you're in there." They came in, all three of them. They looked around the empty house in silence. Wesley cursed through his teeth. Lance crouched beside me, put a hand on my shoulder. "We're here, Sarge," Dex said quietly. "We're with you." I held out the papers to them. They read in silence, passing the sheets to each other. "I'm sorry, brother, but she—" Wesley exhaled. "I know," I interrupted him. "I know everything." Lance pulled out his phone. "I know a lawyer. Good guy, ex-Marine, he'll help." But I barely heard him. I could see Audrey's face as it had been on our wedding day. The sparkling eyes, the happy smile. Where had it all gone? When had she stopped being the girl I'd fallen in love with? Evening was descending on the empty house. We sat in the kitchen, four men who'd been through the war but were helpless to a woman's guile. Dex silently opened one bottle of beer after another. Wesley smoked, blowing smoke out the open window. Lance was on the phone with a lawyer, writing something down in his notebook, and I stared at the bright rectangles on the walls where our pictures used to hang, and tried to figure out how I could have missed that my life was falling apart. How could I not see the betrayal in her eyes when she handed me those papers? How I could have been so naive. The rain drummed against the window. Somewhere out there, in the darkness, was the woman I loved, the woman I trusted, who betrayed me in a way no one else ever had. "What are you going to do?" Dex asked. I remained silent. What could I do? The house I'd bought with my army savings no longer belonged to me. The woman I'd given my heart to was gone, taking my faith in people with her. "We'll fight," Lance said firmly. "We made it through Afghanistan. We'll make it through here too." I looked at my friends. Dex, collected and calm, like before a combat mission. Wesley, angry and ready to act. Lance, reliable as always. Maybe they're right. Maybe this is just another battle. It's just that now the enemy wears expensive perfume and knows how to lie beautifully. I spent the night in an empty house, sitting in a chair in the living room. My friends offered to go to one of theirs, but I declined. I needed to stay here, among the ghosts of the past, among the light rectangles on the walls that kept the memory of happy days. Morning brought a headache and an envelope in the mailbox. I recognized her handwriting, neat, with a slight slant to the right. It was the same handwriting on the greeting card she had sent me in Afghanistan. The envelope was thick, expensive, not the kind we usually used. Even in that little thing, I could feel the change. A new Audrey, with expensive perfume, suits, and envelopes. I sat with the letter on the porch, hesitant to open it. Neighbors walked by, some taking their kids to school, some walking their dogs. They all averted their eyes, pretending not to notice me. News travels fast in a small town. "Dear Garrett," the letter began. Her handwriting was firm, without hesitation. She knew what she was writing. "I've been thinking a long time about how to write this letter. I guess I'll start with the main thing. I'm leaving, and it's not about you. Really, it's not about you. It's about me and how my life has changed this year. You know, while you were in Afghanistan, I realized I could be different. Not just a military wife waiting for her husband to come home from the war. I started building a career, meeting new people, seeing the world through different eyes. I met a man who showed me what life could be, without the constant fear of a husband at war, without that oppressive expectation of a funeral, without having to start all over again every time after another business trip. I'm sorry about the papers. I know it was mean, but I didn't see any other way out. This house, it's like a symbol of our past life, a life that isn't mine anymore. Don't try to find me. Don't try to get it all back. Sometimes you just have to let go and start over. You're strong, you'll get through this. You have your friends, your service, your principles, and I have my own way now. Goodbye, Audrey." I reread the letter over and over until the letters began to blur in front of my eyes. Each word was like a knife in my heart. Not in you. My own way. Goodbye. The phone vibrated a message from Dex. "How are you?" How am I? I didn't know. There was an emptiness inside, the same emptiness I'd felt in the house where happiness used to reside. I got up, walked through the rooms. Her scent was still in the bedroom, a mixture of perfume and something subtly familiar. In the bathroom, there was a forgotten hair clip, a small one with a butterfly. In the kitchen, a mug of unfinished coffee, her favorite, with "Good morning, beautiful." Little things, shards of a former life. There was a photo album on the living room table, the only one she hadn't picked up, probably forgotten in her haste, or left it there on purpose, as a final greeting from the past. I opened it. The first photo was of us meeting on campus. She's in a summer dress, laughing, covering her face from the sun. I'm in a military uniform, so young and naive. What follows is a chronicle of our love. First date, first vacation together, proposal of marriage, the wedding, housewarming in this house. My first deployment to Afghanistan. She cries on the platform but tries to smile. When did it all go wrong? At what point did her smile become different? When did that new sparkle appear in her eyes? The doorbell rang, snapping me out of my memories. Lance stood on the doorstep with a bag of groceries. "Thought I'd stop by," he said, walking into the kitchen. "Making a great burger, remember?" I remembered. In Kandahar, he'd often talked about his signature burgers, promising to make one when we got home. He silently started cooking, and I sat at the table, watching his confident movements and thinking about how strangely life works. The man with whom I'd shared a foxhole under fire was now making me breakfast in my empty house. "You know," Lance said, flipping a cutlet, "my sister went through a similar thing. Husband left her for someone else, left her with 2 kids. Thought her life was over, and now she's got her own business, new husband, everything's fine." I knew what he was trying to say, that life goes on, that it wasn't over, but there was still an emptiness inside. The phone vibrated again. Wesley. "Bro, we're gonna get you out of this shit." Lance put a plate of steaming burger in front of me. "Eat it. You can't think straight on an empty stomach." I obediently took the burger, but each bite felt like sand in my mouth. I remembered how Audrey and I used to have breakfast together on weekends. She made pancakes, not very skillfully, often burnt, but lovingly. "What's in the letter?" Lance asked, sitting down across from me. I silently held out the envelope to him. He read slowly, frowning more and more with each line. The day dragged on endlessly. I tried to occupy myself by sorting through the things left in the house, boxing up photos, letters, postcards. Every little thing brought new pain. Here are the movie tickets from our first date. Here's a dried flower she'd saved from the day I proposed. Here are the letters from Afghanistan. I wrote her every week, even when I didn't have the time or energy. Lance left this afternoon. He'd been called in for a shift at the hospital, but before he left, he made me promise to call if I needed anything. Dex arrived that evening. Sitting silently in his chair, he pulled out a bottle of whiskey. "You want one?" I shook my head. I needed a clear head. "You know," he said after a long silence, "I saw them together, her and that lawyer, a month ago at a restaurant downtown. I wanted to tell you, but I wouldn't have believed it," I finished for him. He nodded. We both knew it was true. I wouldn't have believed it then. Maybe I didn't fully believe it now either. I woke up the next morning with only one thought: to find her. The anger that had been smoldering inside since yesterday turned into cold determination. No more sentimentality, no more memories. It was time to act. The first thing I did was to call the newspaper where she worked. The receptionist answered the phone. "Audrey Thornton? Oh, she quit a week ago. Said she was moving to another city." Of course. Everything was planned in advance. Every move, every action. I squeezed the phone so hard the plastic crackled. Dex arrived early, bringing coffee and donuts. He always showed up exactly when he was needed, another army habit. "Here's the plan," he said, spreading out some papers on the table. "Wesley checks every real estate agency in town. Someone put the house up for sale. Lance is calling hospitals and clinics. See if she renewed her health insurance at the new place." I looked at my friend, who acted as if we were planning another military operation. In a way, we were. "What about you?" I asked. "And me?" He smiled, that same sniper's smile I remembered from Afghanistan. "I found something interesting about her new friend. He pulled a photo out of the folder, a little blurry, obviously taken from afar. It showed Audrey sitting in some expensive restaurant with a man in an impeccable suit. They were holding hands. I felt everything inside me turn upside down. It was one thing to suspect, and quite another to see it with your own eyes. Cameron Holbrook, Dex continued. 35 years old, real estate attorney, office downtown, apartment in a high-end complex, divorced, no kids, specializes in real estate transactions and... He paused, property division in divorces. I crumpled the photo in my fist. So that's who helped her draw up those documents. That's who taught her how to cheat on her own husband. The doorbell rang. Wesley had arrived. He smelled of motor oil and cigarettes. Found the agency, he said from the doorway. Divine Properties. Guess who their legal counsel is? Holbrook. I gritted my teeth. Bingo, bro. I paced the room, feeling my blood boil. It was all coming together. Everything had been planned. While I'd been risking my life in Afghanistan, they'd been cooking up this plan. Every detail, every move. There's something else, Wesley smoked, blowing smoke out the open window. A girl from the agency got to talking, said Mr. Holbrook is personally handling the sale of the house, and the price is twice the market value. I stopped. There was a pounding in my temples. They want to sell my house that I bought with my army savings, the one I've been paying the loan on for 5 years. Easy, Sarge. Dex put a hand on my shoulder. We're not going to let that happen. The phone rang. Lance. Garrett, she renewed her insurance. It's at a clinic in Lincoln. Looks like they've moved there. Lincoln, only 2 hours from here. I felt my fingers involuntarily clench into a fist. I'm going there, I said, grabbing my jacket. Wait. Dex blocked my path. Don't get too hot. We need a plan. Fuck the plan, I almost shouted. She stole my house, tricked me, used me. That's exactly why we need a plan, he said calmly. To do it right. I sank down onto the couch, feeling my hands shaking. The rage demanded an outlet, but I knew Dex was right. You can't act rashly. Wesley brought glasses of whiskey from the kitchen. Have a drink, brother, and let's think. We were sitting in the living room, 3 military men planning an operation to recover a stolen house. Dex was spreading out some paperwork. Wesley was calling his contacts in Lincoln, and I was trying to quell the rage raging inside. Here's the deal, Dex said. We need to gather evidence first. All the documents, all the paperwork. Then, find witnesses to how she manipulated you with those signatures. Mrs. Parker, I remembered. She saw Audrey leaving with the stuff. Great. Wesley, go over to her place, get an affidavit. Wesley nodded and walked out. I looked out the window at my yard, where that damn for sale sign still stood. Inside, I was seething with rage. Lance came back, bringing some printouts. Look, he spread the papers out on the table. Here are the statements from the registry office. The house was deeded to her 3 days ago. And here, he showed another document, is the statement of sale, filed an hour after the registration. I took the papers. Her signature was sure, clear, just like the letter where she'd written, I'm sorry, and don't try to find me. God, what a woman she is. Take it easy. Dex put his hand on my shoulder again. We'll fix this. But I couldn't be calm anymore. Her face, so innocent when she'd asked me to sign those papers, was in front of me. It's just a formality, honey. You trust me, don't you? I did. Oh, how I trusted her. I stepped out onto the porch, needing some air. It was getting evening. Neighbors were coming back from work down the street, children playing somewhere. Just an ordinary, peaceful life. A life that had been stolen from me. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A message from an unknown number. Garrett, stop looking. It's over, Audrey. I reread the message several times. Every word reverberated with pain and rage. Is it over? No, it was just beginning. Dex, I called out. We have a number. He hopped out on the porch, grabbing my phone. Great. Let's run a trace on where he's registered. Inside, everything was boiling. I looked at my house, the house I'd fought for, the house I'd bought with my own money, the house I dreamed of growing old in. And this woman I trusted more than anyone in the world had just taken it away. Just wiped it all out with the stroke of a pen. "We'll find her," Dex said without taking his eyes off the phone. "And we'll find that lawyer too, and we'll make them pay for everything." I nodded. "Yeah, we'll find them." And then, I didn't know what would happen then. All I knew was that I wouldn't stop until I got what was mine, and until they regretted what they'd done. After all, I've been through a war. I know how to fight. And if they want a war, they'll get one. The trail led us to Lincoln, a city like hundreds of other American cities, with typical office buildings in the center and quiet residential neighborhoods on the outskirts. We arrived early in the morning, me behind the wheel, Dex in the passenger seat studying a map of the city on a tablet. "Divine Properties opens the office at 9, he said without taking his eyes off the screen. "We have time for coffee." We stopped at a small diner across the street from the high-rise building that housed the real estate company's office. The coffee was lousy, but hot. I stared out the window at the glass doors of the office center, imagining her walking in there every morning, in an expensive suit, high heels, new haircut. "There they are," Dex said quietly. A black Lexus pulled up in front of the entrance. He got out first, Cameron Holbrook, in an immaculate gray suit, carrying a leather briefcase, opened the passenger door. And that's when I saw her. She looked different. Expensive suit, styled hair, confident gait. Nothing like the girl who once waited for me from the army. He put his hand on her waist, a familiar, possessive gesture. "Easy, Sarge." Dex put a hand on my shoulder. "Not now." I watched them enter the building, as the guard nods respectfully at them. How Holbrook holds the elevator door for her. All in such a calibrated, the right gesture. We waited another hour. Dex methodically photographed everyone going in and out of the building. Wesley and Lance were canvassing nearby offices, looking for anyone who might know something. At noon, Lance called, "Got something. The girl at the coffee shop on the first floor says they come in together a lot. Have been for months." A few months. So it all started when I was in Afghanistan. While I was covering the backs of my comrades in the desert, she was building a new life here. "And another thing," Lance continued. "She heard them talking a week ago. Something about a house in the suburbs they're going to buy after they sell some real estate." My house. They were going to buy a new house with the money from the sale of my house. I walked out of the diner, needing some air. The anger that had been smoldering inside all these days had turned into a cold, burning rage. I leaned against the wall, closed my eyes. A picture stood before me. Our first day in that house. How we'd painted the walls, how we'd argued about the color of the curtains, how she'd laughed when I'd stained the paint with my nose, how we dreamed of the future. "Garrett!" Dex's voice snapped me out of my memories. "They're coming out." They were walking to the car, happy, confident. She was saying something. He was laughing. There was a scarf around her neck, an expensive silk scarf, just like the papers she'd made me sign. "I'm going to kill him," I gritted through my teeth. "No," Dex said firmly. "We'll do better than that. We'll make him give it all back." Wesley appeared as if out of nowhere, another army habit. "There's an address. They're renting an apartment in a luxury complex on the west side of town." I looked at my friends. Dex, collected and calm, like before a combat mission. Wesley, ready for action. Somewhere on the other side of town, Lance was waiting our insurance policy in case something went wrong. We followed them all day. They had lunch at an expensive restaurant, then went to look at some house in the suburbs, a big one with a pool and tennis court. I watched her walk around the property, showing Holbrook something, and everything turned inside. This was supposed to be our house, our future home that we dreamed of. Instead, she was planning a future with someone else, stealing everything I had from me. In the evening, they drove back to their compound. I sat in the car across the street, looking out the lighted windows of their apartment. They moved behind the curtains. Two shadows merged into one. "Want to know what I found out?" Dex held out a file folder to me. "He's pulled this kind of thing off twice already, helped military wives sign over property to themselves while their husbands were in the service." I leafed through the papers, feeling my fingers go numb. 2 cases, 2 divorces, 2 houses sold for nothing. And everywhere, his signature, his law firm. Bastard, I exhaled. He used her, taught her how to cheat me. Not just taught you. Dex pulled out another document. Look at the dates. He met her a month before you left for Afghanistan. It was all planned from the beginning. I stared at the dates, and it went dark in front of my eyes. That night when she'd been late to work for the first time. That day when the new perfume arrived. That week when she suddenly took an interest in our finances. Everything was falling into place. Every piece of the mosaic was falling into place. What are we going to do? Wesley asked, lighting a cigarette. I looked at their windows, at their shadows behind the curtains, at his expensive car in the driveway. We'll make him pay for everything. Dex nodded. I have a plan, but you're going to have to keep your cool, Sarge. I knew he was right. You can't act on emotion. You can't let rage take over. But how I wanted to go up there, kick down the door, grab that sucker bastard by the throat. They think they've won, Dex continued. They think you're broken and helpless. That's their weak spot. In the darkness of the cabin, his eyes glittered. The same sniper's look I remembered from Afghanistan. The look of a man ready to pull the trigger. Tomorrow, he said. Everything will be tomorrow. I nodded. Until tomorrow. I could wait until tomorrow. In the meantime, for now I'd look out their windows and imagine wiping that smug smile off Holbrook's face, making him regret the day he decided to ruin my life. My phone vibrates in my pocket, a message from Lance. All set. Tomorrow he'll regret contacting us. Yeah, he will. They both would. I leaned back in my seat, feeling a cold, burning rage growing inside. The rage of a man who'd had everything taken from him. A man with nothing left to lose. Tomorrow. Everything would be decided tomorrow. The plan was simple. Wait for Audrey to leave for work and pay Holbrook a visit at his office. Dex insisted we look presentable. No army clothes, no rough boots. Suits, ties, polished shoes. We have to speak his language, he said, adjusting my tie in the lobby of the office center. The language of power isn't always fists. I nodded, even though everything was boiling inside. My fists itched at the thought of Holbrook's smug face. Wesley and Lance took up positions at the emergency exits in case our lawyer decided to run. The receptionist, a young blonde with painted fingernails, looked at us with a professional smile. What can I do for you, gentlemen? We're here to see Mr. Holbrook. Dex placed a business card from some construction company on the counter. About a real estate investment. She chirped something into the phone, then nodded. Mr. Holbrook is expecting you. Holbrook's office matched his image perfectly. Expensive furniture, paintings on the walls, a view of the city from the panoramic windows. He rose from his desk to meet us, trim in a perfectly fitting suit. Gentlemen, what can I do for you? He paused, recognizing me. Fear flashed in his eyes. Hello, Cameron, I smiled, feeling a wave of rage rising inside. Shall we talk real estate? He tried to press a button under the desk, but Dex shook his head. No need. Security's really busy today. Some suspicious package on the first floor. Holbrook slowly lowered his hand. His self-confidence was melting before his eyes. What do you want? He asked, trying to keep his tone businesslike. I sat down in the chair across from him, unbuttoned my jacket. There was a picture on the table, him and Audrey at some kind of reception. She in an evening gown, he in a tuxedo, happy. You know, Cameron, when I was in Afghanistan, we used to talk a lot about honor, about what separates man from animal. His gaze darted to the door, but Dex was already standing there, leaning against the jamb with a deceptively relaxed look. Mr. Thornton, Holbrook tried to pull himself together, if this is about your divorce? It concerns you being a professional fraud. I placed a file folder on the desk. 2 similar cases in the last 3 years. Military wives serving overseas, conversion of property, real estate sales. He turned pale. This is slander. I have an impeccable reputation. Impeccable so far, I agreed. But what happens when these documents get to the military prosecutor's office, or to the bar association, or the local newspapers? Sweat broke out on his forehead. The expensive suit didn't seem so perfect anymore. "What do you want?" he repeated. "For starters, to get my house back." I stepped forward. "And to confess to Audrey how you used her, how you've used other women before her." "I didn't," he stammered under my gaze. "I loved her. I really did." "Like those previous two?" Dex walked over to the table, placing a few more pictures in front of it. "Told them about love too? Also taught them how to fool their husbands?" Holbrook grabbed a glass of water, spilling half of it. "You don't understand. These were just normal real estate deals." "Shut up," I said quietly, but he flinched as if from a blow. "You've got an hour. In an hour, I want to see the deeds to the house back, and Audrey needs to know the truth." "And if she doesn't?" A hysterical note appeared in his voice. I smiled, the same smile I'd saved for special occasions in Afghanistan. "Then we'll keep talking, but no longer in your cozy office." He understood. Real fear flashed in his eyes, not the superficial consternation that had been there at first, but a deep, animal terror. "1 hour, Cameron." I stood up. "Time's up." We walked out of the office. In the reception area, the receptionist was chirping something on the phone, not noticing her boss slowly sliding into his chair, loosening his tie with trembling fingers. "Think he will?" Dex asked in the elevator. "Will do," I was sure. Guys like him always take the path of least resistance. We walked down to the lobby. Wesley and Lance were waiting at their posts, outwardly relaxed, but ready to act at a moment's notice. "Well?" Wesley peeled back from the column. "Waiting," I replied. We settled into the cafe across the street. I stared out the windows of his office and thought about how easy it had been to break that glossy shell. How quickly all his self-confidence disappeared when he realized he was cornered. 40 minutes later, his secretary ran out of the building with some kind of folder. 55 minutes later, Audrey appeared in the lobby, excited, hurrying toward the elevators. "Show's starting," Dex muttered. We could see their silhouettes behind the frosted glass of the office. Saw the way she jumped up, the way she waved her arms, the way he tried to explain something, showing the paperwork. Then she ran out, disheveled, with smeared mascara. Ran past us without us noticing, got into her car. Holbrook showed up exactly an hour later. He had aged about 10 years in that time. "Here," he handed me a folder with trembling hands. "It's all signed. The house is yours again." I looked over the paperwork. Everything was perfectly executed, the same perfect signature he'd helped execute the paperwork against me. "One more thing." He pulled out an envelope. "My application to the Bar Association. Yeah, I'm leaving the profession." "Good decision, better than sitting down." Dex nodded. Holbrook slouched, suddenly looking like a beaten dog. "I really loved her." "No," I cut him off. "You loved the scheme you'd worked out, loved the feeling of power over other people's lives. But that's over." He nodded and strode to his car, no longer with the confident gait of a successful lawyer, but with the shuffling footsteps of a defeated man. "It's done," Lance said. Yes, it was done. I held the deed to my house in my hands, looked at Holbrook as he drove away, and felt emptiness. The rage that had been chasing me all these days suddenly evaporated, leaving behind only fatigue and a bitter taste in my mouth. "Let's go home." Dex put a hand on my shoulder. "It's over." But I knew it wasn't over. Somewhere in the city, there was a woman I loved. A woman who had betrayed me, and I had yet to meet her face to face. She came 2 days later. I sat on the porch of my house, now definitely mine, with title deeds, and watched her walk down the driveway. No longer in an expensive suit, but in simple jeans and a sweater, her hair gathered into a careless ponytail, just like before, like when we were happy. "Hi," she said quietly, stopping at the steps. I stayed silent, stared at her, and tried to see the girl I once loved, the one who waited for me from the army, who baked burnt pancakes on the weekends, who laughed at my stupid jokes. "May I?" She nodded at the steps beside me. I shrugged my shoulders. She sat down, leaving a distance between us, small by the standards of space, but infinite by the standards of what had happened. Cameron told me everything, she said, looking in front of her. About the other women, about how he planned it. There was no longer the confidence in her voice that had appeared over the past year. Just a simple girl from Nebraska again, as she had been when we met. You know, she continued, rubbing the sleeve of her sweater, I really thought I was in love, didn't I? He seemed so special, successful, understanding. I looked at the neighbor's house across the street. There, Mrs. Parker was watering her roses, carefully pretending not to notice us. He showed up when I was having a hard time. Her voice trembled. You were over there in Afghanistan. I dreaded getting a funeral every day. Every phone call, every knock on the door made my heart stop. I remembered her letters from that period. How they became shorter, drier. How her declarations of love disappeared, replaced by descriptions of her working life. He listened. He understood, said all the right words. She grinned bitterly. And then he started talking about the future, about how scary it was to be dependent on a military husband, how important it is to have your own protection, your own property. I was silent. What could I say? That I understood? That I forgive? No, I don't. When he proposed this paperwork plan, I agreed. She looked at me for the first time. I convinced myself it was for both of our sakes, that it was the right thing to do. Right? My voice sounded hoarse. To deceive a man who trusted you? Who loved you? She flinched. I'm confused. He was good at persuasion. Said everyone did it. That it was okay to think about yourself. Children's laughter came from the street. Neighborhood kids racing their bikes. An ordinary evening in the suburbs, just like thousands of evenings before. And then I saw those files. She clenched her hands into fists. Other women, other stories, all the same. Military husbands, repossessions, house sales. I was just another one on his list. I stood up. Couldn't sit next to her anymore. Why did you come, Audrey? She stood up too, wrapped her arms around herself as if she was freezing. I don't know. Maybe to apologize. Maybe to explain. Explain what? I turned to her. How you betrayed everything between us. How you used my trust. Garrett. No. I shook my head. Just leave. She took a step toward me. I can fix this. We can start over. Start over? I laughed. And that laugh sounded scary even to myself. After you tried to steal my house? After you planned the whole thing? She was crying, silently, the way she had once cried when she saw me off for duty. But those tears didn't move me now. I loved you, she whispered. I really did. You know what the worst part is? I looked at her and felt nothing but tiredness. I loved you too, even when I suspected something, even when I saw all the signs. I still loved you. She held out her hand, but I pulled back. Goodbye, Audrey. I hope you find what you're looking for. She stood for a moment longer, then walked slowly toward the wicket. At the exit, she turned around. You're a good man, Garrett? Too bad I realized it too late. I watched her walk down the street, the same flying gait, the same red hair fluttering in the wind. The woman I loved, the woman who had broken my heart. The guys arrived that evening. No call, no warning, just showed up on the doorstep with a 6-pack of beer and a pizza. How are you? Lance asked as Wesley laid out the pizza on the kitchen table. Fine, I lied. Dex silently handed me the bottle. We sat in the kitchen 4 men who'd been through the war and come back different. We talked about nothing, reminisced about the service, made plans for the future. You know, Wesley said, opening another bottle, maybe it's for the best. Better to find out the truth now than later, with kids and all. I nodded. He was right, of course, but that didn't make it any easier. What are you going to do next? Lance asked. I looked at my friends, the only people who had stayed with me when the whole world was falling apart. Live! What else is left? Dex raised the bottle. To new beginnings. To new beginnings, the others echoed. It was getting dark outside the window. Somewhere in the distance, dogs barked, Cars rumbled on the highway. Nebraska lived its normal life, and we were sitting in the kitchen of an empty house, trying to piece together something new. I knew there were many sleepless nights ahead, many memories that would hurt, many moments where I would want to drop everything and start over somewhere else. But I also knew I could handle it.